know, I'm just going to keep quiet a while and let's just have a look at some of these amazing bits of kit as they come in and do a couple of circuits for us before we'll have a chance to see each one individually. But as they come in there's our Centurion, followed by the Soviet T-55, followed by the M47, AMX-13, the American M60. Get your spotter books out there, another Leopard coming on behind. Chieftain, Mark 11 Chieftain coming along there. And then behind that a T-72. Very last of all coming out, Challenger 1. impressive lineup of post-war armour there in our arena. One of the obvious questions that someone asked it earlier today, why on earth aren't all tanks, surely there's an optimum design that we get to and then they should all be the same. And this is a perfect example here as we're looking pretty much the same time. Why do different countries come up with very different designs to do what might be considered the same thing? And part of that reason is, when you think about it, money, it's terrain, where are these, what size of army have we got, what can we afford, how do we want to fight in the future, and all of those things go into play. A lot of it, maybe we might get ourselves into as well. Now, if you read all the books, the chieftain is often described as the first proper main battle tank. And we can talk for hours on definitions, but in other words, at the end of World War II, we were looking, people like Field Marshal Montgomery, he wanted a universal tank. Stop talking about infantry tanks and cruiser tanks. Yes, we might need some light stuff for reconnaissance, but let's merge those ideas together. Most of us would consider the Centurion a great example of doing that, but in all the technical terms, it's chieftain that does it. Chieftain coming along here, a fantastically powerful 120mm gun. Enormously thick armour and very well anchored. His driver in the front, he's lying on his back, supine position they call it. Lower he is means the turret can be lower, and that means you're less of a target to the enemy. That gun doesn't have a traditional back clip, that bit at the front holding it. It actually goes right into the turret, and so the turret is slightly needle point. Again, very hard then to penetrate. You're always going to be firing at it and hitting an angle. And we all know the story of the chieftain, we do, don't we? But it's that idea, it is an enormously effective bit of kit as long as the engine's working on the day. The L70 is a Leyland engine, it has problems, or L60 engine I should say. It has problems. It's supposed to be a multi-fuel. 1954, NATO says, we want all your tanks to have multi-fuel capacity. Everyone ignores it, apart from the British. So we spent ages trying to get our tank to be able to take diesel, petrol, bottle of vodka, hopefully it will still work. It didn't, and that engine had loads of rebuilds in its service life. Never fired its gun in anger at British service, but that didn't mean to say it didn't do its job, because this is the age of deterrence. In other words, those tank crews sat out in Germany, ready to fire those tanks up, do the business. The Russians never attacked, so in a way you can say it worked, it did its job that way. This is what the Germans built when they're allowed to build a tank again from 1955 onwards. Germany, or I should say, of course, don't forget Germany's divided after the war. West Germany, in 55, the NATO says, look, we really need the resources of Germany to help defend ourselves against the threat of the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet forces. So the Bundeswehr is reformed for the first time. They're issued with American tanks like RM-47 you'll see going around in a moment, but then they start designing their own kit. About 10 years for the programme, about average for after the Second World War, to put a tank together. And out comes this, which is the Leopard 1. Amazingly, some of those German wartime designers, Ferdinand Porsche is part of the team originally. A guy called Niekamp, who's been the German guy, who's been really helpful in HWA, the German procurement agency in World War II. He's part of that team that puts the Leopard together. And the other thing about the Leopard, it becomes quite a success. The Germans have decided, don't go for big, thick armour like we did with the King Tiger. As you can see, they've gone for mobility. Thumping great big MTU diesel in the back. Get that great gun off of Britain. This is a 105 gun. Thin armour, but we're going to go hell for leather, so they won't be able to catch up with us. in service, hence a maple leaf on the turret there. Now, when you have a tank in service, different countries have different ideas. Do we replace the whole fleet when we get a new one? Do you put the tank in reserve, or do you give it to your reservist units? Does it seem a bit of a waste to completely scrap a tank, get rid of it that way? Different countries got different ideas on that. And certainly the Soviet Union, their idea was, no, you don't get rid of it. You put it in a store somewhere. You have lesser units, cadre units they call them. There might only be 100 guys, not that many to be able to man them all, but come a war, we'll flood them with reservists and they fat out again, ready to take these tanks to war again. It might not be the premium model, it might not be top of the range, but it still has an effect on the battlefield. Now for Britain, we went through periods where we were looking at replacing the whole of our Centurion fleet with a Chieftain. We ultimately do that, although the Centurions did pass down the line to secondary duties. Some are used till quite late for artillery observation roles, engineer variants, etc. But ultimately we end up trying to put the Chieftain in the main battle tank role that the Centurion was trying to fulfill. Now there were plenty of countries that were prepared to buy our Chieftains when we got rid of them. And one of the countries that was trying to come up with the Chieftain tank was Israel. And the Israelis not only bought tanks from Britain, but they also, when other countries got rid of them, like South Africa, Switzerland, Dutch, they buy them all. And they take them out to Israel. Sometimes they use them as they were. What they tended to do, though, was improve on them. So again, like other countries have copied that, we've got a Swedish Centurion with a later engine, not the original Meteor, with a thirsty petrol engine. They put a diesel engine in its place. And that was, the Israelis were first to do that with a lot of their fleet, because again, it meant that you could go further, more reliable as engine technology advanced, etc. But they tended to keep that 105 gun, or upgraded the earlier Centurions as they bought them. And of course, when they came to the end of their lives, they did other things with them. Built something on the top, made some into armoured personnel carriers, etc. So this idea is you keep using that very expensive bit of kit when it first comes out, so to the advantage of your country. Was the beach armoured recovery vehicle, and that was basically a Centurion hull with a side porter built up that would push landing craft off the beach. We replaced that with some German Leopard variants later on called Hippos. They were still in service in about 2003, we've got one in the collection here. So a stunningly effective and brilliant for the UK tank, because as we said, of the 8,000 produced, about half of them was sold around the world. And in post-World War Britain, we were bankrupt. We really needed that money. So it really helped with exports. Now moving off now is one of those tanks that we were worried about. This is actually a T-55. This particular one made after the war in Czechoslovakia, but the Russians had started designing, or I should call it back then, it was the Soviet Union, had started designing new tanks with frying pan-shaped turrets. It's a rounded turret, ballistically very effective. You haven't got a straight edge to hit, always a chance of a glancing blow. By angling armour, you've also thickened it for a horizontal round to try and penetrate. They designed a tank called the T-44 back in the war. They make it in small numbers, but that, as we talked earlier, actually the T-34, we can improve that, so let's make the T-34-85. They carry on making those till after the war, and they certainly carry on in other countries doing it as well. But then they've got this new design. It's called the T-54 initially. They do another model that they're trying to make proof against nuclear attack. That's a T-55, and it's got a 100mm gun. They put the engine crossways across the back, nice wide tracks for the Soviet landscape, and it's a very effective bit of kit. A nice angled front Class A plate, so again the idea of thickening the armour. 100mm gun, you know, a pretty powerful gun there we're looking at. And the wide track is because again the Soviet Union, you know, getting that idea, it doesn't matter about the road. These are illegal on British roads. They'll rip up the tarmac. One day like today is what's called aggressive track. It bites into the ground. NATO tanks have to have rubber pads so we don't ruin the road that way. But made in enormous numbers, almost certainly the tank. We think the T-34-85, T-54, T-55, we're looking at around 100,000 made over time. And that wasn't just for the Soviet forces, they pass it on. Poland, Czechoslovakia, all those countries that are going to be fighting, and then of course they're looking for other markets. When they're trying to find money, these are then sold into the Middle East, Egypt, other countries, South America end up with them, out to the Far East, the Chinese copy them and make their own version, the Type 59. So lots of these, this is an idea of a tank, goes all over the place. And to many Western eyes, modern tanks, much more sophisticated than this T-55, but they're still out there and they're still going. So remember that, it's easy to be mocking the fact that at the moment the Russian army out in Ukraine are using some really old kit like these tanks, but that's still got a 100mm gun on you. And if you're at the receiving end of that gun, you're not that bothered what generation it comes from, okay? This still works to a degree. We have another issue these days, of course. We have electronics on so many things. If those electronics are jammed, intercepted, power burst, you know, this thing will still work. There's so little to go wrong on it, you can't jam it, you can't do things that way. So lightly drew, still effective tank. I mentioned earlier about the Korean War. America wakes up that we're still going to need tanks. There might be types of warfare where tanks still have a validity. How many times has that happened in the last 100 years? Don't need tanks, all over and done with. End of the tank. Oh, hang on a second, we need a tank. And that's what the Americans realise. Now their own tank force, they get some Shermans, they get some Chaffees, they rush them to Korea that's being invaded from the north. They get M26 Pershings. Some of those are refurbished quickly. They start a new tank program. This one, the M47, hull of the Pershing, new turret on top with a new more powerful gun. It's an interim model, and by the time it's coming out, they've almost already got some other better ideas, like the M48. It has a lot of faults in it. Early days here, 47, but it's not in service with the American forces that long. The M48 is a much more thought-through design that takes over quite quickly. But because they've made a number of these, they're very quickly, as part of mutual aid, various other programs, that America is getting kit to those NATO countries recovering after World War II. They're still building up their own industries in the 50s, early 60s. Like the German Bundeswehr, here, have some of these. So the tank sees enormous service in lots of other armies other than the American army that it was originally designed for. And as you might have watched that video earlier, this has seen a lot of combat all around the world with lots of other armies. Now, as you there of it to help get this restored. And the guy who restored it's driving it around at the moment, which means that's another tank we can show off in our collection. So really grateful for that, and I know you can go and have a look at it later on. That M47 tank there. Absolutely creamed though by Centurions in the combats it ever fought against. Centurions, much better tank. Arab back in Star Wars, M47 didn't do very well. Next tank going round, AMX-13. And it's another one of these tanks that has different stories to it. The French after World War II try and rebuild their own arms industry. They take Panthers and use those. They've got American tanks they've been given, so they use those as well. But France under de Gaulle after World War II, desperate to build their own prestige back up, and some of that means making your own weapons and selling those weapons, just like Britain was doing, to try and get some money back in the bank, you know, if you're a bankrupt nation. So a number of countries were looking to buy tanks, especially after 1950 when the Korean War began. They're all looking, where can we buy? And the French have designed a light tank. They wanted it air portable, AMX-13, 13 tons, it creeps up in weight. This one again, if you look at that little yellow on tanks, little yellow round circle with a numbering, that's its upper weight for bridges. So if you're the military policeman, you're waving it forward, if you know this bridge behind me takes 20 tons, that's okay, I can get this one across. I cannot allow a Centurion across, it's too heavy. So they want this as air portable. They started with a 75mm gun in what's called an oscillating turret. Now if you look at that turret when it goes past, canvas webbing around it, that's the join. The top of the turret goes up and down. The advantage there means you can get a bigger gun in. It's not the gun going up and down, so the whole roof goes up and down when you angle that gun. And so it's a clever way of trying to answer this as a problem. Downside, you've got a big steel to try and seal, especially if you're worried about nuclear or chemical attack. Three-man crew driving down the front, sat right next to the engine, very tight space. That gun in the top there, this is an upgraded one with a bigger gun, big thermal sleeve down the barrel. But it was an effective bit of kit, especially if you had a country that didn't want or didn't have the road space, etc., for a massive tank. So Switzerland looked at this thinking, oh, that'd be great for all our mountain roads. And of course also it was cheaper, and that's still attractive to many countries. So sold all over the place, the MX-13, still appearing, still in service for some countries, lots of upgrade programs went through it, and it was part of a sort of sales pitch as well, to say that France were back in the game. And Britain and France, we were competing with this tank. We were trying to sell our Centurions, they were turning up saying, oh look at this one, you can buy this cheaper, and you'll see how these sagas go on. Switzerland, prime example, they end up buying some of these for certain parts of the country and forces. What they really wanted is the Centurion. At the time they got the money together to buy the Centurion, we're busy elsewhere, we need them for ourselves, Korean War. Only 5 years later we go back and say, yeah, you can now buy Centurions, we've got enough there to go around, sort of thing. Now this gun's got a muzzle brake on the end. It's another one of those things you'll see on a lot of tanks. So what's the idea of a muzzle brake? At the end of the barrel, that round piece has got what they call baffles in it. It's got little flat plates. And the idea is once the round has been fired by the gun, it flies out the end of the barrel with supersonic speed, followed by all those expanding gases from the explosion inside the breech. That's what forced the round out. Now if you capture some of those gases against these baffles, it pulls the gun forward, so it's not recoiling as much. And again, you know, you've got to the point where some muzzle brakes can stop the recoil up to 50%. And that's great because it means that again, in the space there, you can put a bigger gun in, you don't need so much room for that gun to recoil. Most tank crews, if you've got a damaged muzzle brake, you can't fire the gun because otherwise it will just smash your rear of the turret. service. We've had the M47, the M48. They often you see them under the heading the Pattern family of tanks. There's a sort of similarity to them in their physical appearance, but they just get bigger. This looks like a bit like one of those earlier M47s, but on steroids. The Americans at one point, they were criticised for lacking ambition in their tank design. They just tended to go, well, let's build another one and let's add 2 inches of armour and another 3mm on the gun sort of thing. And in a way, it worked for them because it could be done to mass production that the Americans could do. It didn't necessarily mean it was a top of the range tank, but there was quite a few of them. Underneath, so if you go over a mine, the mine blast goes up the side and not captured underneath, which can flip you over. That's the worst thing to do. 105mm gun, that British L7 gun that was done for the Centurion, again for about 20 years, best gun out there. So they'll pop that on, they'll build it under license. They were going to have a laminate armour on this. Lots of new technologies around the corner, but like so many countries, if we wait, nearly there, if we wait, nearly there, you'll be there forever. So they decide to go for steel protection, very thick, whopping grain, Continental diesel engine on the back to give it enough power. And there you are with that sprocket, the drive sprocket. Worth pointing out, as you see all this now, all those wheels on the ground, not powered at all, just spreading the weight of the heavy tank out over the track. The only powered wheels, one of the teeth on at the back. Wheels at the front, keeping the track nice and tense as it goes around. Now on the top, they give it a mini cupola for the commander with a 50 caliber machine gun in there. That can contra-rotate, you can look around at other things whilst main guns facing the other way. And this particular one was gifted to the museum by the US Army in Europe. Again, tanks like this, US Army first, then on to the Marine Corps. They were still using them in the Gulf War, and then they get sold and passed on all around the world. Lots of these still in service, quite often again in the Middle East with extra armour put on. Things like those little square, look like big blocks of chocolate all over the outside. Era, reactive armour it's called, laser in the Israeli's design. So if it's hit, it blows up, takes a blast away from the main hull of the vehicle. Now the Soviets are the people who build tanks, that's all there is to it. If you're talking about numbers, tens of thousands in the 30s, hundreds of thousands plus in World War II, and they carry on doing it. T-54, T-55, 100,000. Every 10 years they're coming out with a new model. This is the one that actually they came out with. This is the T-72. Soviet designers start their thought process by saying, listen, if you can make a tank nice and low, you're going to be a harder target to hit. So how do they do that? They get rid of the guy who has to stand up, the loader. Because if you have to stand up and pick up those shells to put them in the breech of the gun, get rid of you, the turret can be lower, the whole vehicle can be lower. So with the T-70, well the T-64 is the first one, and this T-72, they've got a carousel below the turret, and it's got an auto-loader system. So an arm comes up, rams in the shell, followed by the bag of explosives to blow it out, and hopefully not your arm or anything if you get in the way. We can get rid of the loader then. So you've got a less lots of technology going into it. As so many of these projects, it went over budget, it went over time, and we were running out of time because our chieftains were getting old. In Britain, we were building this tank for the Shah of Iran, sheer tank. He bought a series of tanks from Britain, and the last tank was called Shear 2, and it was going to look very much like this one. It got chopper armour, we were giving them chopper armour, this new fantastic armour, same gun as Chieftain, where the problem lay that the Shah of Iran was deposed, and the new regime just won the tank. So what we do in Britain, we actually look at this tank and we say, okay, with a few adjustments, we could probably take that on. And it might not be the tank we ideally want, but we'll put it into service anyway. And that's what we do. We call it Challenger 1. It's basically the same gun kit as Chieftain, powerful gun, very good, etc. New engine in the back, it's a CV12 engine, so a big thumping great diesel engine in the back there, but the key one, chopper armour as well. This new, it's the first time on a British tank that we put into service. We invented it back in the 60s, here we are at last on one of our tanks. And that goes to see service in the Gulf War, first Gulf War, against some of these things that were going around, supported by the Iraqi army. T-72, 125mm smoothbore gun. They're getting to the point they can even fire missiles out there to extend the range of that gun. Missile launch tube, as it were, rather than just a tank barrel. And again, what they call gill armour, those little pads on the side, you can pull them forward. They might detonate a hollow charged weapon like an RPG or bazooka round before it hits it. But in the background, don't forget, this is not the tank the British Army wanted. They wanted that new technology MBT 80 would bring. And so Vickers start putting together the design of taking some of that MBT 80 technology, the hunter-killer system, different ways we might be able to fight that tank, improving reliability, what's going to make that tank that much better on the battlefield. We know we're up against